Hey there, it's time for Little Men. Sorry I skipped today. I've been trying to label videos. Stories for children. Of course, they're for adults too, but you don't have that choice. I need one that says for everybody. Oh my goodness. And then the other ones are labeled for adults, or will all be. So much work. And who knows what'll happen. Okay, so they were having a show of some sort. And Nat had that boy that he brought home. He's company, so I'll pay for both, said Nat handsomely as he stuck 2 crooked pins in the dried mushroom which served as a money box. With a nod to the company, they seated themselves on a couple of boards, and the performance went on. After the monkey act, Ned gave them a fine specimen of his agility by jumping over an old chair and running up and down ladders, sailor fashion. Then Demi danced a jig with a gravity beautiful to behold. Nat was called upon to wrestle with Stuffy and speedily laid that stout youth upon the ground. After this, Tommy proudly advanced to turn a somersault, an accomplishment which he had acquired by painful perseverance. So he's been practicing in private till every joint of his little frame was black and blue. His feats were received with great applause, and he was about to retire, flushed with pride and a rush of blood to the head, when a scornful voice in the audience was heard to say, "Ho, that ain't anything." Reckon who said that? "Say that again, will you?" And Tommy bristled up like an angry turkey cock. "You want to fight?" said Dan, promptly descending from the barrel and doubling up his fist in a business-like manner. "No, I don't," and the candid Thomas retired a step, rather taken aback by the proposition. "Fighting isn't allowed," cried the others, much excited. "You're a nice lot," sneered Dan. "Come, if you don't behave, you shan't stay," said Nat, firing up at the insult to his friends. "I'd like to see him do better than I did, that's all," observed Tommy with a swagger. "Clear the way, then." And without the slightest preparation, Dan turned 3 somersaults, one after the other, and came up on his feet. "You can't beat that, Tom. You always hit your head and tumble flat," said Nat, pleased at his friend's success. Before he could say any more, the audience were electrified by 3 more somersaults backwards and a short promenade on the hands, head down, feet up. This brought down the house, and Tommy joined in the admiring cries which greeted the accomplished gymnast as he righted himself and looked at them with an air of calm superiority. "Do you think I could learn to do it without its hurting me very much?" Tom meekly asked as he rubbed the elbows which still smarted after the last attempt. "What will you give me if I teach you?" said Dan. "My new jackknife has got 5 blades and only one is broken." "Give it here, then." Tommy handed it over with an affectionate look at its smooth handle. Dan examined it carefully, then putting it into his pocket, walked off, saying with a wink, "Keep it up till you learn, that's all." Oh my gosh. A howl of wrath from Tommy was followed by a general uproar which did not subside till Dan, finding himself in a minority, proposed that they should play stick knife. Whichever one should have the treasure. Tommy agreed, and the game was played in a circle of excited faces, which all wore an expression of satisfaction when Tommy won and secured the knife in the depth of his safest pockets. He got his knife back. "You come off with me and I'll show you around," said Nat, feeling he must have a little serious conversation with his friend in private. What passed between them no one knew, but when they appeared again, Dan was more respectful to everyone, though still gruff. in his speech and rough in his manner. And what else could be expected of the poor lad who had been knocked about the world all his short life with no one to teach him any better? The boys had decided they did not like him, and so they left him to Nat, who soon felt rather oppressed by the responsibility, but too kind-hearted to desert him. Tommy, however, felt that in spite of the jackknife transaction, there was a bond of sympathy between them, and longed to return to the interesting subject of somersaults. He soon found an opportunity, for Dan, seeing how much he admired him, grew more amiable, and by the end of the first week was quite intimate with the lively Tom. Mr. Bear, when he heard the story and saw Dan, shook his head, but only said quietly, "The experiment may cost us something, but we will try it." If Dan felt any gratitude for his protection, he didn't show it, and took without thanks all that was give him. He was ignorant, but very quick to learn when he chose, had sharp eyes to watch what went on about him, a saucy tongue, rough manners, and a temper that was fierce and sullen by turns. He played with all his might, and played well at almost all the games. He was silent and gruff before grown people, and only now and then was thoroughly sociable among the lads. Few of them really liked him, but few could help admiring his courage and strength, for nothing daunted him, and he knocked tall Franz flat on one occasion with an ease that caused all the others to keep at a respectful distance from his fist. Mr. Bear watched him silently and did his best to tame the wild boy, as they called him, but in private the worthy man shook his head and said soberly, "I hope the experiment will turn out well, but I'm a little afraid it may cost too much." Whew. Not slobbering today. I'm dry. No drool. Mrs. Bear lost her patience with him half a dozen times a day, yet never gave him up, and always insisted that there was something good in the lad after all, for he was kinder to animals than to people. He liked to rove about in the woods, and best of all, little Ted was fond of him. What the secret was, no one could discover, but Baby took to him at once, gabbled and crowed whenever he saw him, preferred his strong back to ride on to any of the others, and called him "my Danny" out of his own little head. Teddy was the only creature to whom Dan showed an affection, and this was only manifested when he thought no one else would see. But mothers' eyes are quick, and motherly hearts instinctively divine who love their babies. So Mrs. Joe soon saw and felt that there was a soft spot in rough Dan, and bided her time to touch and win him. But an unexpected and decidedly alarming event upset all their plans and banished Dan from Plumfield. Tommy, Nat, and Demi began by patronizing Dan because the other lads rather slighted him, but soon they each felt there was a certain fascination about the bad boy, and from looking down upon him they came to looking up, each for a different reason. Tommy admired his skill and courage, Nat was grateful for past kindness, and Demi regarded him as sort of an animated storybook, for when he chose, Dan could tell his adventures in a most interesting way. It pleased Dan to have the three favorites like him, and he exerted himself to be agreeable, which was the secret of his success. The Bears were surprised, but hoped the lads would have a good influence over Dan, and waited with some anxiety, trusting that no harm would come of it. Dan felt they did not quite trust him and never showed him his best side, but took a willful pleasure in trying their patience and thwarting their hopes as far as he dared. Mr. Bear did not approve of fighting and did not think it a proof of either manliness or courage for two lads to pommel one another for the amusement of the rest. All sorts of hearty games and exercises were encouraged, and the boys were expected to take hard knocks and tumbles without whining, but black eyes and bloody noses given for the fun of it were forbidden as foolish and brutal play. Dan laughed at this rule and told each exciting tales of his own valor and the many frays that he had been in, that some of the lads were fired with the desire to have a regular goodwill. "Don't tell, and I'll show you how," said Dan, and getting behind a dozen of the lads together behind the barn, he gave them a lesson in boxing, which quite satisfied the ardor of most of them. Emil, however, could not submit to be beaten by a younger fellow than himself, for Emil was past 14, and a plucky fellow, so he challenged Dan to a fight. Dan accepted at once, and the others looked on with intense interest. What little bird carried the news to headquarters, no one knew, but in the very hottest of the fray, when Dan and Emil were fighting like a pair of young bulldogs, and the others with fierce, excited faces were cheering them on, Mr. Bear walked into the ring and plucked the combatants apart with a strong hand and said in the voice they seldom heard, "I can't allow this, boys. Stop it at once, and never let me see it again. I keep a school for boys, not for wild beasts. Look at each other and be ashamed of yourselves." "You let me go, and I'll knock him down again," shouted Dan, sparring away in spite of the grip on his collar. Come on, I ain't thrashed yet," cried Emil, who had been down 5 times but did not know when he was beaten. "They're playing be gladly what you call 'ems, like the Romans, Uncle Fritz," called out Demi, whose eyes were bigger than ever with the excitement of this new pastime. They were a fine set of brutes, but we have learned something since then, I hope, and I cannot have you make my barn a coliseum. "Who proposed this?" asked Mr. Bear. "Dan," whispered several voices. "Don't you know that this is forbidden?" "Yeah," growled Dan sullenly. "Then why'd you break the rule?" "They'll all be mollycoddles if they don't know how to fight." "Have you found Emil a mollycoddle? He doesn't look much like one," and Mr. Bear brought the two face to face. Dan had a black eye and his jacket was torn to rags, but Emil's face was covered with blood from a cut lip and a bruised nose, while a bump on his forehead was already as purple as a plum. In spite of his wounds, however, he still glared upon his foe and evidently panted to renew the fight. "He'd make a first-rater if he was taught," said Dan, unable to withhold the praise from the boy who made it necessary for him to do his best. "He'll be taught to fence and box by and by. Until then, I think it would do very well. I think he will do very well without any lessons in mauling. Go and wash your faces, and remember, Dan, if you break any more of the rules again, you will be sent away. That was the bargain. Do your part, and we'll do ours." The lads went off, and after a few more words to the spectators, Mr. Bear followed to bind up the wounds of the young gladiators. Emil went to bed sick, and Dan was an unpleasant spectacle for a week. But the lawless lad had no thought of obeying and soon transgressed again. One Saturday afternoon, as a party of the boys went out to play, Tommy said, "Let's go down to the river and cut a lot of new fish poles." Take Toby to drag them back, and one of us can ride him down, proposed Stuffy, who hated to walk. That means you, I suppose. Well, hurry up, lazy bones, said Dan. Away they went, and having got the poles, were about to go home when Demi unluckily said to Tommy, who was on Toby with a long rod in his hand, "You look like the picture of the man in a bullfight, only you haven't got a red cloak or pretty clothes on. I'd like to see one. There's old Buttercup in the big meadow right at her time, and see her run," proposed Dan, bent on mischief. "No, you mustn't," began Demi, who was learning to distrust Dan's propositions. "Why not, little fuss button?" demanded Dan. "I don't think Uncle Fritz would like it. Did he ever say we must not bullfight?" "No, I don't think he ever did," admitted Demi. "Then hold your tongue. Drive on, Tom, and here's a red rag to flap at the old thing. I'll help you stir her up." And over the wall went Dan, full of the new game, and the rest followed like a flock of sheep, even Demi, who sat upon the bars and watched the fun with interest. I believe Dan's going to be gone pretty soon. Poor Buttercup was not in a very good mood, for she had been lately bereft of her calf and mourned for the little thing most dismally. Just now she regarded all mankind as her enemies, and I do not blame her. So when the matador came prancing towards her with the red handkerchief flying at the end of his long lance, she threw up her head and gave a most appropriate moo. Tommy rode gallantly at her, and Toby, recognizing an old friend, was quite willing to approach, but when the lance came down on her back with a loud whack, both cow and donkey were surprised and disgusted. Toby back with a bear of remonstrance, and Buttercup lowered her horns angrily. "At her again, Tom. She's jolly cross and will do it capitally," called Dan, coming up from behind with another rod, while Jack and Ned followed his example. Seeing herself thus beset and treated with such disrespect, Buttercup trotted round the field, getting more and more bewildered and excited every moment, for whichever way she turned there was a dreadful boy yelling and brandishing a new and very disagreeable sort of whip. It was great fun for them, but real misery for her, till she lost patience and turned the tables in the most unexpected manner. All at once she wheeled round short and charged full at her old friend Toby, whose conduct cut her to the heart. Poor slow Toby backed so precipitately, I'm sure I screwed that up, that he tripped over a stone, and down went horse, matador, and all in one it's divided ignominious heap. While distracted, Buttercup took a surprising leap over the wall and galloped wildly out of sight down the road. "Catch her, stop her, head her off, run, boys, run," shouted Dan, tearing after her at his best pace, for she was Mr. Bear's pet, Alderney, and if anything happened to her, Dan feared it would be all over with him. Such a running and racing and bawling and puffing as there was before she was caught. The fish poles were left behind. Toby was trotted nearly off his legs in the chase, and every boy was red, breathless, and scared. They found poor Buttercup at last, in a flower garden where she had taken refuge, worn out with the long run, borrowing a rope for a halter. Dan led her home, followed by a party of very sober young gentlemen, for the cow was in a sad state, having strained her shoulder jumping so she limped. Her eyes looked wild, and her glossy coat was wet and muddy. "You'll catch it this time, Dan," said Tommy as he led the wheezing donkey beside the mistreated cow. "So will you. You helped." "We all did, but Demi," added Jack. "He put it into our heads," said Ned. "I told you not to do it," cried Demi, who was most broken-hearted at poor Buttercup's state. "Oh, Bear will send me off, I guess. Don't care if he does," muttered Dan, looking worried in spite of his words. "We'll ask him not to, all of us," said Demi, and the others assented, with the exception of Stuffy, who cherished the hope that all the punishment might fall on one guilty head. Dan only said, "Don't bother about me," but he never forgot it, even though he led the lads astray again as soon as the temptation came. When Mr. Bear saw the animal and heard the story, he said very little, evidently fearing that he should say too much in the first moments of impatience. Sorry, my nose itches. Buttercup was made comfortable in her stall, and the boys sent to their rooms till supper time. This brief respite gave them time to think the matter over, to wonder what the penalty would be, and to try to imagine where Dan would be sent. He whistled briskly in his room so that no one should think he cared a bit. But while he waited to know his fate, the longing to stay grew stronger and stronger. The more he recalled the comfort and kindness he had known here, the hardship and neglect he had felt elsewhere, he knew they tried to help him, and at the bottom of his heart he was grateful. But his rough life had made him hard and careless, suspicious and willful. He hated restraint of any sort, and fought against it like an untamed creature, even while he knew it was unkindly mean, and dimly felt that he would be the better for it. He made up his mind to be turned adrift again, to knock about the city, as he had done nearly every day, nearly all his life, a prospect that made him knit his black brows, doing them together, and look about the cozy little room with a wistful expression that would have touched a much harder heart than Mr. Bear's if he had seen it. It vanished instantly, however, when the good man came in and said in his accustomed good way, "I have heard all about it, Dan, and though you have broken the rules again, I'm going to give you one more trial to please Mother Bear." Dan flushed up to his forehead at this unexpected reprieve, but he only said in his gruff way, "I didn't know there was any rule about bullfighting, as I never expected to have any at Plumfield. I never did make such a rule," answered Mr. Bear, smiling in spite of himself at the boy's excuse. Then he added gravely, "But one of the first and most popular of our few laws is the law of kindness to every dumb creature on the place. I want everybody and everything to be happy here, to love and trust and serve us, and we try to love and trust and serve them faithfully and willingly. I have often said that you were kinder to the animals than any of the other boys, and Mrs. Bear liked that trait in you very much because she thought it showed you had a good heart, but you have disappointed us in that. And we are sorry, for we hope to make you quite one of us. Shall we try again?" Dan's eyes had been on the floor, and his hands nervously picking at the bit of wood he had been whittling as Mr. Bear came in. But when he heard the kindly voice ask that question, he looked up quickly and said in a more respectful tone than he had ever used before, "Yes, please." "Very well, then, we'll say no more, only you will stay at home from the walk tomorrow, as the other boys will, and all of you must wait on poor Buttercup till she is well again. So I had to take care of her. I will. Now go down to supper and do your best, my boy. More for your own sake than ours. Then Mr. Bear shook hands with him. And Dan went down, more tamed by kindness than any he would have, more tamed by kindness than he would have been by the good whipping which Asia had strongly recommended. Dan did try for a day or two, but not being used to it, he soon tired and relapsed into his old willful ways. Mr. Bear was called from the home on business one day, and the boys had no lessons. They liked this and played hard till bedtime. When most of them turned in and slept like dormice, Dan, however, had a plan in his head, and when he and Nat were alone, he unfolded it. Look here, he said, taking from under his bed a bottle, a cigar, and a pack of cards. I'm going to have some fun and do as I used to with the fellas in town. Here's some beer I got of the old man at the station, and this cigar. You can pay for 'em, or Tommy will. He's got heaps of money, and I haven't a cent. I'm going to ask him in. No, you go. They won't mind you. Folks won't like it, began Nat. They won't know Daddy Bear is away, and Mrs. Bear's busy with Ted. He's got croup or something, and she can't leave him. We shan't sit up late or make any noise, so where's the harm? Asia will know if we burn the lamp long. She always does. No, she won't. I've got a dark lantern on purpose. It don't give much light, and we can shut it quick if we hear anyone coming, said Dan. This idea struck Nat as a fine one and lent an air of romance to the thing. He started off to tell Tommy, but put his head in again to say, you won't dim me too, don't you? No, I don't. The deacon will roll up eyes and preach if you tell him. He'll be asleep, so just tip the wink to Tom and cut back again. Nat obeyed and returned in a minute with Tommy half dressed, rather tousled about the head and very sleepy, but quite ready for fun as usual. Now keep quiet and I'll show you how to play a first-rate game called poker, said Dan, as the three revelers gathered round the table on which were set forth the bottle, the cigar, and the cards. First, we'll all have a drink. Then we'll take a go at the weed, the cigar, and then we'll play. That's what the men do, and it's jolly fun. The beer circulated in a mug, and all three smacked their lips over it, though Nat and Tommy did not like the bitter stuff. The cigar was worse still, but they dared not say so, and each puffed away till he was dizzy or choked. When he passed the weed on to his neighbor, Dan liked it, for it seemed like old times, when he now and then had a chance to imitate the low men who surrounded him. Like them as he could, and getting into the spirit of the part he assumed, he soon began to sweat under his breath, for fear someone should hear him. You mustn't. It's wicked to say, damn. Sorry about that, cried Tommy, who followed his leader so far. Oh, Hank, don't you preach, but play away. It's part of the fun to swear. I'd rather say thunder turtle, said Tommy, who had composed this interesting exclamation and was very proud of it. And that dam was like a water dam. And I'll say the devil. That sounds well, added Nat, much impressed by Dan's manly ways. Dan scoffed at their nonsense and swore stoutly as he tried to teach them the new game. But Tommy was very sleepy, and Nat's head began to ache with the beer and the smoke, so neither of them was very quick to learn, and the game dragged. The room was nearly dark, for the lantern burned brightly. They could not laugh loud nor move about much, for Silas slept next door in the shed chamber, and altogether the party was dull. In the middle of a deal, Dan stopped suddenly and called out, "Who's that?" in a startled tone, and at the same moment drew the slide over the light. A voice in the darkness said tremulously, "I can't find Tommy." And then there was the quick patter of bare feet running away down the entry that led from the wing to the main house. "It's Demi. He's gone to call someone. Cut into bed, Tom, and don't tell," cried Dan, whisking all signs of the revel out of sight and beginning to tear off his clothes while Nat did the same. Tommy flew to his room and dived into bed, where he lay, laughing till something burned his hand, and he discovered he was still clutching the stump of the festive cigar which he happened to be smoking when the revel broke up. It was nearly out, and he was about to extinguish it carefully when Nursey's voice was heard, and fearing it would betray him, he hid it in the bed. He threw it underneath after a final pinch, which he thought finished it. So he pinched it, tried to put it out. Nursey came in with Demi, who looked much amazed to see the red face of Tommy reposing peacefully upon his pillow. "He wasn't there just now because I woke up and couldn't find him anywhere," said Demi, pouncing on him. "What mischief are you at now, bad child?" asked Nursey with a good-natured shake, which made the sleeper open his eyes to say meekly, "Only ran into Nat's room to see him about something. Go away and let me alone. I'm awful sleepy." Nursey tucked Demi in and went off to, I know this word. I can't say it. But only found two boys slumbering peacefully in Dan's room. Some little frolic, she thought, and as there was no harm done, she said nothing to Mrs. Bear, who was busy and worried over little Teddy. Tommy was sleepy and telling Demi to mind his own business and not ask questions. He was snoring in 10 minutes, little dreaming what was going on under his bed. The cigar did not go out, but smoldered away on the straw carpet till it was nicely on fire, and a hungry little flame went creeping along till the dimity bed cover caught. Dimity, I guess. Dimity. Bed cover caught, then the sheets, and then the bed itself. The beer made Tommy sleep heavily, and the smoke stupefied Demi, so they slept on till the fire began to scorch them, and they were in danger of being burned to death. Franz was sitting up to study, and as he left the schoolroom, he smelt the smoke, dashed upstairs, saw it coming in a cloud from the left wing of the house. Without stopping to call anyone, he ran into the room, dragged the boys from the blazing bed, and splashed all the water he could find at hand onto the flames. It checked, but did not quench the fire, and the children, wakened on being tumbled topsy-turvy into a cold hall, began to roar at the top of their voices. Mrs. Bear instantly appeared, and a minute after Silas burst out of his room shouting, "Fire!" in a tone that raised the whole house. A flock of white goblins with scared faces crowded into the hall, and for a minute everyone was panic-stricken. Then Mrs. Bear found her wits, bade Nursey see to the burnt boys, and sent Franz and Silas downstairs for some tubs of wet clothes, which she flung on the bed, over the carpet, and up against the curtains, now burning finely and threatening to kindle the walls. Most of the boys stood dumbly looking on, but Dan and Emil worked bravely, running to and fro with water from the bathroom and helping to pull down the dangerous curtains. The peril was soon over, and ordering the boys all back to bed and leaving Silas to watch lest the fire broke out again, Mrs. Bear and Franz went to see how the poor boys got on. Demi had escaped with one burn and a grand scare, but Tommy had not only most of his hair scorched off his head, but a great burn on his arm that made him half crazy with the pain. Demi was soon made cozy, and Franz took him away to his own bed, where the kind lad soothed his fright and hummed him to sleep as cozily as a woman. Nursey watched over poor Tommy all night, trying to ease his misery, and Mrs. Bear vibrated between him and little Teddy with oil and cotton, paregoric, and squeals, saying to herself from time to time, as if she found great astonishment in the thought, "I always knew Tommy would set the house on fire, and now he has done it." Giving the wrong boy the blame, I believe. Okay, guys. Wow, that's 36 minutes, and I'm tired. So that's part 2, and I don't know how much more we got, but Granny's worn out. Let's see here. Let me see. Yep, here it's marked. Okay. Not much more to go, but whew, I just can't. All right, guys, be sweet. Don't be ugly. Now I can't find my space. Well, okay. There we go. All right. I keep trying to got the place marked. That's good enough. Okay. Be sweet. Don't be ugly. May have already said that.